My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. And you've reached the PHRC's Fair Housing and Power Hour. And today we're going to be talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. To get a couple quick housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to let you know that we are recording today's session, and this recording will be available after the presentation today. We always upload it to YouTube and send it out along with any of the slides. So you will get all these materials and links later in the week. And I'd also like to invite you to put any questions or comments in the chat throughout the presentation. We will make sure to allow for time at the end to cover anyone's questions and concerns, but I will also try to cover as much as I can throughout the presentation today. I'd like to thank our interpreters for providing that service for us today and making this presentation accessible, as well as our captioner as well as my colleague Caroline Eister for providing technical assistance. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So for those of you who have joined us for previous Fair Housing and Power Hour sessions, today's going to be a little bit of a different type of topic. So we often provide a basic description on how our housing protections apply to various housing challenges for different groups of people throughout Pennsylvania or different housing situations. So we've covered individuals with disabilities and requesting reasonable accommodations. We've talked about national origin and overcoming language and documentation barriers. We've talked about the home buying process and how to navigate through that, as well as for individuals who've had involvement in the criminal justice system, how to access housing opportunities, all from a fair housing lens. But today we're going to be talking about some structural barriers in housing, some of our current inequalities and how we got there. We're going to talk about some of our past laws and our policies that have shaped our housing opportunities. We're going to share some information about where we are in Pennsylvania and how we can work towards change. So I look forward to a good discussion today, but I acknowledge that this can be a challenging topic. It can be a little heavy at times. It's impacted a lot of folks throughout our history, and I want to acknowledge that, and I want to create space for discussion around it. But we have these conversations because fair housing is the right of all Pennsylvanians. It's the right of everyone to be able to choose the housing that works for them and their households, and it's the responsibility of everyone that's involved in the housing system to make sure that we do have housing opportunities. And we focus on this because housing is so critical. It impacts every single aspect of our lives, from the type of education that we can access for ourselves and our families, what our transportation opportunities look like, our health and well-being, what we're exposed to in our environment, as well as the healthcare services that we can access, our wealth, as well as opportunities. Housing impacts everything. And I know from the familiar names that I see on my screen that a lot of you are really active in supporting individuals that are seeking to access housing opportunities. And you know this isn't news. But to give you an idea of where we're hoping to go with our training today, as usual, we'll provide a brief introduction to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission to let you know who we are and what we do. We're going to share about fair housing laws and protections, and we're also going to talk about housing policies that have perpetuated housing segregation and inequalities. We are going to close out by talking about some ways that we can work to advance these opportunities, and of course, we will answer your questions. So the Human Relations Commission has been around since 1955. We are the agency that works to ensure that people can live, work, and learn free from discrimination in Pennsylvania. But our mission is two-part. The first one, we work to enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws. So that's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So when folks believe that they've experienced discrimination, that's based on their protected class or an aspect of their identity, and issues have come up in their housing, in their education, in their employment, public accommodation setting, commercial properties, they can file a complaint with our agency and we'll have a neutral investigator look into the situation and what happened. But we also act to proactively promote equal opportunity for everyone in Pennsylvania. We do that through trainings like this one. We host events and conferences, virtual offerings, and we also work with volunteers throughout our communities as well through our advisory council and social justice ambassador program as well. If you'd like more information on that, I'd be happy to share that with you, and you'll get some links towards the end of the presentation as well. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we do that through 3 regional offices. So our Western region is served by our Pittsburgh office. We have our Central region, which reaches up into the northeastern part of the state, and that's served by our Harrisburg office. And then our Southeastern region is served by our Philadelphia office. So our regional offices, they do the day-to-day work of investigating complaints, receiving complaints, things like that. And we also have a central office as well that does some of the outreach and administrative functions of the agency. Here's the breakdown of how our laws provide protections in our various subject areas. So the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers the bulk of our protections. That covers employment, housing, commercial properties, public accommodations, as well as primary and secondary education up through high school. There's also the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act, which covers post-secondary education, such as college, trade schools, technical schools, and things like that. But we want to take today's time to focus specifically on fair housing. So we're going to shift gears and do that. I want to talk about our various layers of fair housing laws. So we've got laws at the federal, the state, and the local level. At the federal level, there's the Fair Housing Act, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provide additional protections for individuals with disabilities. At the state level, there's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which I just mentioned, and which is enforced by our agency. And then at the local level, there are local ordinances throughout the state. So there are over 70 different local human relations ordinances, which are carried out by local human relations commissions. So you may have one in your community. There are various protected classes, and they differ a little bit at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. So, your local level Human Relations Commission may add additional protected classes that we won't cover today. So I do encourage you to seek that information out as well. But before we get into the protected classes, I want to talk a little bit about fair housing in general. So the Fair Housing Act of 1968, it made it unlawful to discriminate in housing because of race, color, national origin, and religion. And this applies to the sale and rental of housing, as well as the provision of housing-related services. And that could include lending, mortgages, appraisals, insurance, any of those industries that influence housing opportunities. And then later on, the protected classes of sex, familial status, and disability were added as protected classes at the federal level. It applies very broadly to types of housing: apartments, single-family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. Even some types of shelters are covered under fair housing protections. And there are 2 main types of discrimination. We call them discrimination theory. So disparate treatment is that's defined as treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So it's what a lot of folks think about when they think about blatant housing discrimination. So an example, looking at the protected class of disability, would be if someone would go to apply for an apartment and they would be told, nope, you can't rent here because of your disability. We're not going to rent this place to you. Disparate impact, on the other hand, can be a little bit more subtle. So it's a policy that's neutral on its face, but it has a disparate impact or a disproportionate impact on members of a protected class. So looking again at the protected class of disability, it could look like a housing provider's policy that you need to have full-time employment to be eligible to rent there. Now, it doesn't mention disabilities at all, but individuals with disabilities are less likely to have full-time employment. A lot of folks with disabilities may not be able to work full-time. Not everyone, but a substantial portion of that group of individuals. So if you've got this policy that excludes folks who can't work full-time or don't work full-time, that policy may have a disparate impact on that group. All right, and here you can see the breakdown of protected classes. So we already discussed the federal protected classes um, a little bit. So race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, sex, and disability. You'll see that on for the state level, we expand on that a little bit. We add on age 40 and above. We add on ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. So it's even more expansive. All right. Now, next we're going to talk about the goals of fair housing. So goal number one gets a lot of focus, ending housing discrimination. We've had a substantial amount of public education around housing rights, both statewide and nationwide, as well as there's substantial resources behind investigations when there's allegations of housing discrimination that are submitted to enforcement agencies such as ourselves. But we haven't paid the same amount of focus to goal number two, promoting diverse, inclusive communities, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So that's defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected classes. Now that's a long definition, but it's looking at how we can work to actively dismantle housing barriers that have been built up in our country over the past century and beyond. How do we work to make sure that we can access housing no matter what our skin color is, no matter what our religion is, no matter what our ability is? And how do we make sure that all of our communities are places of opportunity? So in looking at affirmatively furthering fair housing, I'd like to offer a brief timeline, since we talked about it not being something that was actively enforced, actively promoted, actively engaged with until very recently. So 1968 was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And in the 1990s, there was the rule where grantees of federal funds were required to conduct an analysis of impediment to fair housing. But there were some limitations to this system. There wasn't a lot of regulatory guidance, and there wasn't a lot of clarity around what a fair housing choice is and how to overcome barriers to overcoming it. There wasn't necessarily that connection to a locality's planning systems as well. So there wasn't a lot of enforcement. In 2015, the Obama administration promulgated the AFFH rule, which required grantees to conduct an assessment of fair housing in AFH. So this was really designed to increase the specificity and accountability for localities. But there were critiques of this, that it was too extensive, too technical, and too labor intensive. And it was repealed back in 2020 when the administration changed. But that also removed accountability for meaningful action to advance housing opportunities. And then in 2021, the interim final rule was put back into place for AFFH. And in 2023, there was a notice of proposed rulemaking, which created or proposed creating a new framework and equity plan for areas to look at barriers to fair housing and to take action on that. But that was perhaps a little more technical than some of our attendees were looking for. And I want to talk about what fair housing and affirmatively furthering fair housing actually is. So looking at the three components that support AFFH. So it's looking at actual choice. Do we actually have the existence of realistic housing opportunities? Protected choice. Do we have housing that can be accessed without discrimination? And number 3, enabled choice. Is there realistic access to sufficient information regarding opportunities so that any choice is informed? And I would posit that we have room to go in all 3 of those areas in Pennsylvania. We're going to focus mostly on actual choice, since that's a substantial barrier, and I think a lot of folks on this call would recognize that as well. We don't have the amount of housing supply that we need. For every 100 extremely low-income rental households, there's only 39 affordable and available rental units. When we're looking at the very low-income threshold, there's only 69 units for every 100 households. And we've got a shortage of 266,000 affordable housing units that are needed in Pennsylvania. And that's according to data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And that means that a lot of households are accessing housing that they can't afford. So they're cost burdened. And cost burdening is when you pay more than 30% of your income towards your housing costs, including rent, a mortgage, utilities, things like that. So according to data from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, to rent a 2-bedroom home without that cost burdening, a person who makes the minimum wage would need to work 115 hours per week. And we know that our Black and brown households are more likely to experience cost burdening than our white households, according to the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. And the programs that are designed to help households who need assistance in getting housing that's affordable to them, oftentimes it's really challenging to access that. Even the housing programs that we have, the affordable housing that was created through the LIHTC program, a lot of that's expiring and going away because of the life cycle of the tax credits. So a lot of this housing is going to increase in cost and be out of reach for a lot of households, according to the Picture of Preservation report. Looking at the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8 housing, 3 out of 4 households that are eligible to receive these benefits don't receive them. And over half of Housing Choice Voucher waitlists are closed. The majority of them have been closed for greater than a year. So even households that need it, would qualify, aren't necessarily able to get on the waiting list to get a voucher and to have that voucher accepted, because a lot of local landlords don't accept those vouchers anyway, and there isn't a requirement for housing providers to accept those those vouchers. Looking at our housing quality, the median age of housing in Pennsylvania was built in 1963. So that's before our lead-based paint laws were passed. And it's older than the national average. I think we have some of the oldest housing stock in Pennsylvania, which means that there are a lot of maintenance needs. Almost 90% of rural municipalities don't have any type of property maintenance code. So a lot of households struggle to get needed habitability upgrades made to make sure that they have adequate heat, electricity, protection from leaks that would create mold and air quality issues, things like that. And then lastly, there's a power imbalance between a lot of landlords and tenants. There aren't a lot of protections for tenants that need to report issues, whether it's getting those habitability requests made and getting those repairs done, or reporting discrimination or other issues. A lot of folks aren't willing to report issues because they don't want to destabilizing the housing that they have, because there aren't a lot of opportunities for them to get other housing. And we know that all of this has a disparate impact on individuals in protected classes. Looking at protected choice, hundreds of Pennsylvanians file complaints of discrimination each year, some to our agency, some to HUD, some to local human relations ordinances. But we know that even more fail to file complaints, either because they don't know their rights or they might fear retaliation and not be willing to come forward to make those complaints. And then lastly, looking at enabled choice. We know that there's significant unmet need about how people can access programs, services, and housing opportunities. And we know that this specifically impacts individuals with disabilities who face substantial barriers to accessing housing that does meet their needs. But how did we arrive here in this situation? I think it's helpful to take a step back, maybe 2 or 3, to go back and look at some of our policies and laws that have brought us to this place. And we're going to go all the way back to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. So this declared that all persons born in the United States are citizens without distinction of race or color or previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. This was our nation's first civil rights law, and it's still cited today in civil rights cases. Closely followed with that, there is the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So no state shall make or enforce any law that shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of our laws. So these offer substantial protections, right? But they didn't prevent a lot of the policies and practices that would come in the next century. They didn't prevent redlining, blockbusting, steering, restrictive covenants, or exclusionary zoning. And we're going to go through those now. So looking specifically at zoning first, the first zoning ordinance was in 1908 in Los Angeles. So the Los Angeles City Council passed the ordinance, and what it did was it took laundries, which were mostly run by Chinese entrepreneurs, and they put them in an industrial category. This was designed in order to keep these Chinese individuals out of white neighborhoods by putting them in that special designation. And then the first racially explicit zoning code was in Baltimore, Maryland in 1910. And that stated that Black individuals weren't allowed to live in white neighborhoods and vice versa. In 1916, New York City adopted the first citywide zoning ordinance in the United States. So unlike LA's earlier ordinance, it applied to all of New York City, and it achieved a lasting reduction in density in Manhattan. So what it was trying to do was to make sure that city canyons weren't blocking out sunlight by making the buildings too tall and too close up to the street, requiring further setbacks. But it also was seeking to separate different types of businesses by class, making sure that the department stores weren't right next to the factories, and really creating that class distinction, as well as the change in architecture as well. So in 1917, there was a court case, Buchanan versus Worley. So the Supreme Court ruled that a zoning ordinance in Louisville, Kentucky prohibited the sale of property in a white neighborhood to a Black buyer, and vice versa is unconstitutional. So it says that race-based zoning is not acceptable. So unfortunately, that didn't solve the problem in the United States. And even though there wasn't race-based zoning that happened after that, there still were zoning ordinances that achieved the exact same effect. They worked to create these distinctions by socioeconomic class, and then they also used things like deed restrictions, race-based covenants, and the financing of housing to achieve that racial segregation. And a big thing that really enabled that was in 1924, when the U.S. Commerce Department published the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, which was a model law for the United States to promote zoning regulations. So 55,000 copies of this were sold, and then 19 states passed laws based on this. Before this, a lot of the laws and ordinances that were passed were kind of piece by piece in municipalities, this really standardized it and provided a guidebook on how to do that. And the advisory council for this publication was composed of outspoken segregationalists. And it really laid the foundation for land use controls in the United States. And I would be remiss in kind of charting our country's path into the mid 20th century without talking about the practice of redlining. So in 1934, our country was in the midst of the Great Depression. A lot of folks were experiencing great financial hardship, and there was a lot of concern that people would default on their mortgages and that the housing market would become destabilized. So the Federal Housing Administration was created to boost homeownership, and the FHA insured home mortgages, but only for houses that were well within the boundaries of white neighborhoods. So it led to the industry standard practice of redlining, which systematically withheld credit from home buyers in Black neighborhoods. In addition, the FHA favored loans for new suburban construction over older urban properties, substantially contributing to the urban decay and the growth of white suburbia. And you can see on the map here, which appears to be a map of Philadelphia, that the redlining practice, the way we referred to it, is based on the actual colors of the map. So you'll see there's 4 colors on there. There's green, there's blue, there's yellow, and red. So the green neighborhoods were the best neighborhoods. Those were the ones that the FHA, along with the real estate professionals and other folks that were involved in creating these maps, they designated as the least risky neighborhoods to invest in. The blue was still good, not quite as good as the green, but it's still a pretty solid bet. The yellow was declining, and then the red was considered to be the most hazardous, and the red is what's referred to in the redlining. The issue is that these designations were made on the basis of folks' race, their national origin, and their religion, and it was explicit. You can find in a number of sites online actual quotes from these redlining maps stating why they were designated these colors and these levels of risk. And that really set to place a lot of the disinvestment in these communities of color, and the simultaneous investment in wider suburban communities as well. And we see these impacts today. So this is that same redlining map from Philadelphia from the 30s, and it's a screenshot of a social vulnerability map in Philadelphia today. So this is from the project, it's called Not Even Past, which was put into place with NCRC and the University of Richmond. And it looks to see the correlation between these areas of disinvestment and the conditions in our communities today. So the social vulnerability index looks at the resources of a community to respond to emergencies, like how people can be able to address challenging situations, whether it's a national disaster, whether it's another security emergency. Are they able to access resources and address these situations? And you can see that the pink and the red and the orange correlates to the red and the yellow, indicating that that these impacts are still happening today. To break that down a little bit, we see that impacting in generational wealth. So redlined areas are associated with a long-term decline in home ownership, home values, and credit scores among minority communities, all of which continue today. We see this in education, looking at the exclusion of minority communities from key resources in urban areas, such as educational facilities. We see this in health and safety, with formerly redlined areas tending to have older housing stock, which were initially left to decay, and through the years created environmental issues impacting water and air quality. And we see this through disinvestment, with redlined communities suffering from a lack of investment in housing, education, and community development, all dating back to the origins of the Homeowner Loan Corporation in 1934 in partnership with the FHA. Now, zoning and redlining were the only practices. I showed this graphic to show that there's a lot happening in this period between the 30s, the 50s, and 60s to really foster and cement this housing inequality in our communities. We've got the single family zoning, which limits what types of housing can be built in what areas, making sure that there aren't affordable housing opportunities that are in communities that are more exclusive, really keeping that exclusivity, that high purchase price, and excluding a lot of folks from those communities. We've got these loans that are sponsored by the government at really great rates and fostering development that was unheard of in our country. But these were only provided to white communities. When there would be segregated communities that were being planned and built, they couldn't get this type of financing unless they agreed to put in these racial covenants and these deed restrictions to make sure that that these communities were exclusively white. At the same time, there were all of these urban renewal projects happening in our urban centers, and unfortunately, a lot of these facilities and highways and things that were being built, they often happened in communities of color, tearing down entire communities, cutting them off from other resources and other neighborhoods, really cementing that exclusion. There were steering practices from real estate agents that directed people to different communities based on their skin color and their identity. I mentioned the deed restrictions, the racial covenants. Public housing was racially segregated at the beginning, and very explicitly so. And then there are blockbusting practices as well that real estate agents participated in, really profiteering off of people's fear of segregation and what that might happen to, how that might impact their property value. So when there were fears of integrated communities happening, real estate agents would encourage folks to sell at a very low price and then jack up the price to communities of color or households of color that would be coming into those communities. And I also want to lastly mention the GI Bill benefits. Well, these were available to veterans. Unfortunately, veterans of color weren't able to utilize these. They were excluded from a lot of educational opportunities because of their color, and then they couldn't buy into these new communities that were being built and take advantage of that mortgage assistance. And then they had difficulty getting the mortgages and insurance in these disinvested communities too. So it was a lose-lose situation. And all of these practices work together to produce our current housing inequality. So I'd like to take a step back here and look at an analogy. For those of you who are familiar with track and field, this track might look pretty familiar. It's a round oval track. And in this first image, we have everyone starting at the same place. However, if everyone's starting at the same place on a round track and running a whole lap around, it's not going to be a fair race, will it? No, because the person in lane 8 is going to have to run a lot further than the person in lane 1 because they're running around the whole exterior of the track. So that's why in many races, you'll see these staggered starts. So that way everyone runs the same amount of track. When we look at housing, we know that we're running on a curved track. We know that a lot of people have been able to build generational wealth through a lot of these practices and policies. And a lot of folks have been excluded from that according to their identity, because of their race, because of their national origin, their religion, their ability, their sex. So people have very different resources and are competing for housing on this curved track. So what we're proposing is that there needs to be investments in equity, which staggers the lane, which makes sure that we have programs that can support households for that homeownership has been out of reach, or even quality rentals, safe rentals in communities of opportunity have been out of reach. So the first image, we titled equality. Everyone's starting at the same place, ending at the same place. The second is equity. So equality is what we want, to all be able to run and end at the same place, but equity is how we get there. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read this whole section from the PHRA, but it's a great thing to review later on once you get this. It's section 2, and it really provides the why of why we do this work. It warns about the harms of discrimination and segregation, and it highlights how it impacts every aspect of our society and how it hurts all of us. And it really provides a strong case for the work that we need to do today. It was written all the way back in 1955, but it still rings true today. So I want to revisit this. Housing is everything: education, transportation, health, wealth, and opportunity. So how do we get there? It's at this point in the presentation when I hear myself talk, I'm like, wow, this is really depressing. We have really not done enough to address these substantial structural barriers that were put into place. And now we're seeing that in the slides that I covered at the beginning, looking at the choices that people have and the barriers that people have. But I think there is some good news to share, and it's that we can work together for housing justice and housing change, both at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. We're going to be focusing today mostly at the local and the state level, since that's our agency's focus in states and localities throughout Pennsylvania, but I do want to touch on the federal level as well. And this work doesn't happen alone. We don't need to have communities that are siloed. And I think this is beautifully illustrated by the socio-ecological model that you see on the screen here. And our opportunities are shaped by a multitude of factors, ranging from the individual all the way up to the national policy level. And we need to be working through partnerships, everywhere from the one-on-one skill and knowledge building that can happen through our personal relationships, through our social service agencies that are connecting folks with the resources and the knowledge that needs to happen for folks to access housing opportunities, all the way to our broader networks and our organizations, our institutions, all the way up to our public policy, our local, state, and federal laws. So I want to start with our local governments, since they're a really key player in ensuring housing opportunities, in shaping what housing can be built in our communities. And let's be honest, there needs to be a lot of housing that needs to be built because of our significant housing gap. We haven't had enough housing that's been built to keep up with our population needs. So we need to examine our land use and our zoning laws to make sure that they are not restrictive in ways that impacts individuals in protected classes. We need to look at our occupancy restrictions to make sure that they are not overly restrictive that might impact families and other households. Reasonable accommodation processes are crucial to allow individuals with disabilities the ability to live out in the community, just like anyone else. And we often see that group homes for individuals with developmental disabilities, individuals who live in recovery homes, are unable to get that reasonable accommodation that's needed, that change in policy that would allow them to live out in the general community. There still is residential real estate steering that happens. There was a report that was published a couple of years ago. It's called Long Island Divided, and it's a particularly striking illustration of how home buyers can be steered towards certain communities and away from certain communities based on their race and ethnicity. Patterns of community opposition. When affordable housing is being built, or mixed-use housing, there's often a lot of opposition to that from neighbors and community stakeholders who fear changes to their neighborhood and keep these needed resources from being built. We see economic pressures such as increased rents, land and development costs, particularly in communities that are experiencing a lot of economic growth and gentrification. Municipal service and state services and amenities look very different from state to state, and we need to have an eye on equity there, or community to community throughout the state, and we need to have an eye for equity there, as well as looking at foreclosure patterns and how they're impacting different protected classes. To dive a little bit deeper into zoning, there are some practical fixes that can help to foster housing diversity to make sure that we're building the needed housing and adopting the needed housing infrastructure to support individuals from all incomes and also all protected classes in our communities. So one option is upzoning from single-family zoning, that exclusionary zoning, to allow more housing choice, simplifying those review processes for affordable housing projects, and allow for housing development by right instead of conditional zoning. This minimizes patterns of community opposition that are often fueled by fears of increasing housing diversity, as well as removing the practical impediments that keep projects from being able to pencil out or be achievable for developers. Whether that's large lot size requirements, parking minimums, height restrictions, and setback requirements, as well as road and housing configurations. There's a lot of barriers that make it very infeasible to build larger housing projects that are able to make housing more affordable rather than that single family housing that we see in a lot of our communities. So how can we address this? How can we engage with our local governments to support these efforts? For those of us who aren't in local government ourselves, we can attend zoning and planning meetings to make sure that we're in the loop with all the things that are being discussed, being aware of your local codes and ordinances and plans. Advocating for these changes that can increase opportunity of diversity of housing choices, like we discussed in the previous slide, supporting affordable housing projects in your community. When you hear that these plans are being proposed, coming out to the meeting and supporting the projects that you know are seeking to meet the unmet housing needs in your community. If you're in the space of group homes and other types of housing for individuals with disabilities that need to request reasonable accommodations, making sure that you're requesting those and then reporting fair housing issues that are occurring in your community when you become aware of them. There are a number of types of programs and services that can support landlord-tenant relationships and help to overcome barriers for individuals just trying to get into quality rental housing, such as housing location and navigation to provide that support in the housing search. Landlord risk reduction programs, which help landlords not carry the burden of all of the of renting to someone with a checkered rental history or who may have had involvement in the criminal justice system or poor credit or something like that. Mediation to help people resolve the conflicts which can arise in a landlord-tenant relationship, as well as rental assistance to help folks who might need a little assistance to get past a rough patch and avoid the step into homelessness and other housing insecurity. Fair housing education, we always promote that, and I would not be doing my job well if I didn't put in a quick plug for that. A lot of groups can benefit from fair housing education so that they understand their space in the housing infrastructure and how we can all work together to support housing opportunities. And if anyone is interested in learning more, please reach out to me via email. I'm happy to set up free training for your group. And I want to touch on some statewide recommendations that we put forward in our white paper. And my colleague is going to put the link in the chat there for everyone to access our white paper, since that's where a lot of the data from the beginning of the presentation came from. But in that paper, we also included recommendations for moving forward, examining how we can implement source of income protections to make sure that folks that are able to access vouchers and housing assistance are able to actually use that voucher and to use it in a community of opportunity to access quality housing. We need to look at what our state code enforcement looks like and how we can make sure that when you move from community to community, you're able to access safe and healthy housing regardless of the neighborhood that you're living in. We need to look at increasing funding for affordable and middle market housing, and we need to increase our monitoring for the issues impacting fair housing choice. And these are all issues that PHRC advocates on behalf, and we also work with our partners on behalf of as well. Before I jump into our resources, I just want to say that as we're engaging in these AFFH efforts, we need to be working together in our communities. That way we're fully understanding what needs are happening in each community. Of course, we have issues and trends that go across communities, but there's also issues and concerns that are unique to each community. So it's important that you have representation from individuals from a wide variety of protected classes that have lived experience and can highlight the needs that are are in your community. It's good to have the perspective of housing providers, municipal leaders and officials, your planning professionals and developers, your community development, finance institutions, your social service providers, those advocating on behalf of individuals with disabilities, folks with fair housing expertise, and more. This is a conversation that involves all of us, so it's important to make sure you've got diverse coalitions that are addressing these housing needs. And lastly, I want to highlight some resources from our agency that can help you support you in this work. I mentioned our white paper and our trainings. Feel free to join us for future Empower Hours. We'll be releasing our next quarterly schedule in the next week or so. And we also have our full back catalog on our YouTube page as well. You can join our efforts at the local level through our advisory councils and ambassador program. We've got lots of written resources as well through fact sheets and brochures that are on our website. We have a program on PCN TV where we have a lot of conversations around these broader housing issues and barriers and how we can work together to address them. And that's called PHRC Speaks for Housing in the 21st Century. And lastly, we've got a way for you to stay in the loop with what we're doing through our quarterly newsletter. And you can either email me directly to get on that, or there'll be a feedback survey in just a minute, and you can put your email in there as well. I do want to highlight that we've got a conference that's going to be focusing on holistic approaches for disability inclusion and resolving conflict for individuals with disabilities. That's going to be happening in just about 2 weeks on Tuesday, July 9th. It's going to be in Harrisburg as well as virtual, and I'd love to invite anyone who's interested to join us there. It's completely free. And my colleague's going to put that in the chat as well, the link to register and see our schedule. I'd encourage you to join us there. Lastly, I want to leave you with some more links for further learning on some of these historical practices and their impact today. So you can see a lot of that on the screen, and you'll get that through the slides. I want to acknowledge that a lot of this data and information around the subject has been pioneered through Richard Rothstein through The Color of Law, as well as his recent book with his daughter, Leah Rothstein, Just Action. And those are both excellent resources if you're looking to learn more about this topic. But please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, concerns, and follow-up from this presentation. There's a QR code on the screen, and my colleague is also going to put that in the chat. And it provides feedback on what you thought of this presentation and this training, what we can do better, and what you'd like to see for future trainings. So that way we can make sure that this is meeting your needs. But with that, I think we've got a couple minutes to open up for questions. So I'm going to take a look at the chat to see if there are any questions and comments. I'm not seeing a whole lot. I know this wasn't quite as interactive as some of our Fair Housing and Power Hours, but I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to get through this content since I knew that we had a little bit more on the agenda today. But for anyone that would like to ask any questions, please feel free to put a message in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can also unmute you as well. That's an option as well if you're more comfortable with that way of voicing a question. So I'll give it a couple minutes, but feel free to enter anything in the chat. But that's the end of our content today. So you can also feel free to head out if you don't have any questions or comments to add. Thank you all for joining us for today's Fair Housing and Power Hour session, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'd like to give another thank you to our interpreters and our captioner as well for making this program accessible. We're really grateful for the work that you do in helping us to make this program fully accessible. All right, since there's nothing in the chat, I am going to close out this session. So thank you all and have a great afternoon. Take care.